Across the span of 17 inhabited star systems, among the countless species who had clawed, slithered, or thoughtfully reasoned their way up from their respective evolutionary ladders, one truth stood universal and unquestioned: civilized beings did not hunt for their food. They synthesized it. They cultivated it in hermetically sealed agricultural stations. They printed it molecule by molecule from base proteins. The very idea of chasing down another living creature, killing it with primitive tools, and then consuming its flesh was the sort of thing you found in archaeological databases under the category of behaviors our ancestors abandoned when they discovered fire, the wheel, or basic dignity. The Expeditionary Survey Corps took this truth as fundamental gospel. Their survival training consisted of 17 lectures on equipment maintenance, 42 seminars on emergency beacon protocols, and one rather uncomfortable afternoon discussing what to do if you encountered a species that still ate other species on purpose. The answer, for the record, was to back away slowly and file a very detailed report. No one in the Corps actually expected to survive primitively. Why would they? Their shuttles had backup systems for the backup systems. Their ration synthesizers could produce nutritionally complete meals from atmospheric carbon. Their environmental suits could regulate temperature, pressure, and humidity to keep you comfortable in anything short of the surface of a star. Survival training was theoretical, the way learning ancient literature was theoretical. Interesting, historically relevant, and completely useless in practical application. This confidence in technology, this absolute faith in the supremacy of advancement over adaptation, was about to meet a rude and somewhat damp contradiction. Commander Vectris of the Xeranthi Collective stood in what remained of Survey Shuttle 47 and carefully did not panic. Panic was inefficient. Panic wasted calories that might be needed for more productive activities, like filling out the incident report that was going to haunt his personnel file for the next decade. His compound eyes clicked methodically from one piece of shattered equipment to the next, cataloging failures with the grim determination of someone who knew exactly how bad things were and refused to admit it out loud. "Communications array?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Non-functional," Lieutenant Cora replied. The Peloton's skin had gone from its usual pleasant blue to a sickly grey-green that suggested his internal organs were considering a vote on whether to continue participating in this whole staying-alive business. Also on fire. Or it was. Now it is just melted. Ration synthesizer. Also non-functional. And also formerly on fire. Emergency beacon. "I have good news and bad news." Ensign Drummeth chimed in, his crystalline form refracting the dim light into depressing little rainbows across the cave walls. "The good news is that the beacon is functional and transmitting our distress signal. And the bad news, the storm is generating electromagnetic interference across 17,000 square kilometers. Our signal has approximately the same range as shouting very loudly. Also, rescue protocols indicate that no shuttle can safely enter the atmosphere until the storm passes, which meteorological data suggests will occur in 6 planetary rotations. How long is that in standard time? 9 days, 4 hours and 16 minutes. Plus or minus 6 hours depending on whether this storm system decides to develop a secondary cyclonic structure, which according to my analysis has a 73% probability. Commander Vectris took a moment to practice a calming breathing technique he had learned from a meditation for middle management seminar. It did not help. Inventory. What functional resources do we have? Cora consulted his damaged datapad, which flickered ominously. 3 emergency ration packs. Each contains enough nutrition for one person for one day, assuming that person is not doing anything strenuous like, for example, surviving. So we have food for 3 days if we do nothing, or perhaps 2 days if we do something useful. That is an accurate summary, yes. Medical supplies. 1 basic medkit, fully functional. At least something works. Shelter. They all looked around the cave system they had dragged themselves and their limited supplies into. Water dripped from the ceiling in 17 different places. The wind howled through the entrance with the sort of enthusiasm usually reserved for dramatic opera finales. Small flying creatures that might have been indigenous birds or possibly ambulatory fungi kept swooping through, making sounds like judgmental laughter. Adequate, Vectris said, because lying to yourself was free and occasionally comforting. That was when Specialist Marcus Webb spoke up for the first time since the crash. Could be worse. Everyone turned to look at the human. He was sitting on a rock near the cave entrance, apparently unbothered by the spray of rain that occasionally gusted in, soaking everything within 2 meters. Humans were like that, Vectris had learned, unsettlingly comfortable with mild discomfort. Please, Specialist, Vectris said with the careful patience of someone who desperately needed good news and suspected he was not about to receive any. Explain to us how our current situation could be worse. Could be winter, Marcus said cheerfully. Could be a desert. Could be a gas giant. This is just rain and some wind. Planet's got oxygen. Gravity's comfortable. Temperature's reasonable. We've got shelter and a water source. He nodded toward the dripping ceiling. Honestly, this is pretty manageable. Cora made a sound like a deflating balloon. Manageable? We have food for 3 days and rescue in 9. How is this manageable? Marcus shrugged, a gesture that the universal translators somehow rendered as both casual dismissal and supreme confidence. We get more food. The synthesizer is destroyed. Yeah, but there's food out there. Marcus pointed toward the cave entrance, beyond which the storm continued its atmospheric tantrum. I saw some promising tracks on the way in. Mid-sized creatures, probably herbivores, judging by the gait pattern. Figure I can set some snares, maybe catch enough to keep us fed until rescue shows up. The silence that followed this statement was profound and deeply uncomfortable. It was the sort of silence that happened when someone suggested something so fundamentally bizarre that the brain needed extra processing time to confirm it had heard correctly. Snares, Vectris repeated slowly. You mean traps? Primitive traps? For catching living animals? Yep, to kill them. Generally that is how you get meat from an animal. Yeah, and then eat them. That is traditionally the next step in the process. Drummeth's crystalline structure flickered with what might have been fascination or horror. The two emotions produced similar refractive patterns. You know how to do this personally? Sure. My grandfather taught me when I was a kid. Took me hunting and trapping every fall. You learn pretty quick when you're 11, and freezing your backside off in a deer blind. Marcus stood up and stretched, joints popping with sounds that made Cora flinch. Anyway, storm's not going to get any lighter. Might as well get started while we've still got daylight. You are going out there. Cora's voice had climbed approximately 2 octaves. Little rain never hurt anybody. It is not a little rain. It is a Class 7 atmospheric disturbance with wind speeds approaching 100 kilometers per hour and precipitation rates that qualify as torrential by any reasonable standard. Marcus looked out at the storm, squinted, and shrugged again. I've seen worse in Seattle. Before anyone could formulate a reasonable objection or possibly tackle him before he did something suicidal, the human walked out into the storm. Just walked right out, like he was stepping out to check the mail rather than into a meteorological nightmare that had already destroyed their shuttle and most of their equipment. They watched him disappear into the rain and wind. "He is going to die," Drummond observed clinically. "Immediately," Cora agreed. "We should note the time of death for the report," Vectris said, because even in crisis, proper documentation mattered. They waited for the screaming or the sounds of something large and predatory discovering an easy meal, or simply for Marcus to come staggering back in, defeated by reality and physics. None of those things happened. Instead, after approximately 30 minutes, the human returned, soaking wet and apparently pleased with himself, carrying an armload of twisted metal scraps from the shuttle wreckage, some fibrous plant material, and a collection of straight branches he had apparently taken time to select for quality. "Good news," Marcus announced, water streaming from his hair and clothing in quantities that should have been deeply uncomfortable. "Found some wire that'll work for snare loops. Also found those creature trails I mentioned. Definitely herbivores, probably something like a rabbit or a ground bird analog. They've got a regular path through the underbrush down by that creek, about 200 meters east." He dumped his materials on the cave floor and sat down, immediately beginning to sort through the debris with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "You went out in that storm," Vectris said, still processing the reality of what he had just witnessed, "to collect garbage." "To collect materials," Marcus corrected, not looking up from his work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, bending wire, testing flexibility, selecting the pieces that met whatever criteria he was using. "Can't build snares out of nothing." "Well, you can, but it takes longer, and they're not as reliable." Over the next hour, while the storm continued its assault on the planet's surface, and the three officers watched with a mixture of horror and fascination, Marcus built 6 snares. He explained the process as he worked, his tone casual, like he was describing how to organize files rather than construct devices designed to choke the life out of small animals. "You want the loop about this big," he said, forming a circle with his hands. "Big enough that the animal sticks its head through going for the bait, but not so big it can pull back out easily. The trigger's got to be sensitive, but not too sensitive, otherwise wind or rain will set it off." He tested the tension on one of his creations, nodded with satisfaction. "This should work pretty well." "That is barbaric," Cora whispered. "That is survival," Marcus replied without judgment. "Your call, though. You want to wait for the rations to run out, and then start arguing about who gets eaten first, or you want to let me go set these up and see if we can't have dinner tonight?" No one had a good answer to that question. Marcus took their silence as consent and headed back out into the storm, this time carrying his completed snares and a small bag of what he claimed was bait. He made 6 trips total, setting each trap in what he described as promising locations, which apparently meant something to human sensibilities, but sounded like mysticism to everyone else. When he returned from the final trip, he was carrying something that had been dead for approximately 5 minutes. It looked like a cross between a rabbit and a small reptile, with fur that was probably pretty when it was not matted with rain and blood, and a face frozen in an expression that suggested it had been very surprised by recent events. Cora made a sound like he was being strangled. "First catch," Marcus announced proudly. "This was in one of my old snares from yesterday. Must have triggered while I was setting up the new ones. Lucky break." He held up the creature, maybe 2 kilos of usable meat here. "Not much, but it is a start." "You are not bringing that in here," Vectris said, his voice slightly higher than usual. "Have to. Need to process it." Marcus looked around the cave, evaluating, going to need a fire somewhere with decent ventilation. And I will need to build a smoking rack. A what? For smoking the meat. Preservation technique. We smoke what we catch. It will last the whole 9 days easy, maybe longer. He pointed to a side chamber in the cave system. That'll work. Natural chimney effect. Smoke will vent up and out. Rain won't get in. Give me a few hours. What followed was several hours of activities that would haunt the officer's dreams for years to come. Marcus built a fire using friction and dry tinder he had apparently collected during one of his trips outside. He constructed a smoking rack from more salvaged materials and branches. He processed the small creature he had caught with a piece of sharp metal from the wreckage, working with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The worst part, from the officer's perspective, was how normal he made it all seem. He hummed while he worked. He chatted about the weather. He mentioned that the rain was good for trapping because the animals could not smell human scent as easily in wet conditions. He explained that the key to good smoked meat was maintaining a consistent low temperature and using the right type of wood, which he had identified through some mysterious process that involved sniffing various branches and making thoughtful noises. "You want a sweet smoke, not a bitter one," he said, arranging wet wood around the fire in a configuration that produced more smoke than flame. Different woods give different flavors. This stuff here, he held up a piece of reddish bark, smells kind of like hickory, should be perfect. By nightfall 6 more snares had triggered. Marcus brought in the catches, processed them with the same casual competence, and hung strips of meat over his smoking rack. The smell of wood smoke and cooking meat filled the cave. It smelled, despite everything, surprisingly good. "You should eat something," Marcus said, offering a piece of smoked meat to Vectris. The commander looked at the offered food, at the human's expectant expression, and at his own officers, who were trying very hard not to appear as hungry as they obviously were. He took the meat. It was delicious, and that somehow made everything worse. Over the next 6 days, Marcus maintained his snares, checked them twice daily, and kept the smoking rack constantly full. He worked in the rain without complaint. He built a better shelter structure near the cave entrance, using branches and salvaged material, creating a covered area where they could work without getting soaked. He showed Drumoth how to identify which local plants were edible and which would cause immediate digestive distress. He taught Cora how to check a snare without accidentally triggering it or getting bitten by an animal that was not quite dead yet. He also, to everyone's surprise, started teaching them proper meat processing techniques. Not because they asked, but because Marcus seemed to operate under the assumption that anyone might need to know how to do this at some point. "You want to cut along the grain here," he demonstrated, his hands steady despite the crude tools. "Makes the meat more tender. And you save these parts." He indicated several organs that made Cora look away quickly, because they're actually the most nutritious. Liver especially, high in vitamins. "I will take your word for it," Vectris said, though he dutifully watched the demonstration. The officers, well-fed and increasingly disturbed by their own adaptation to the situation, began to have philosophical conversations around the smoking fire. "I have been calculating the energy efficiency," Drumoth said one evening, his crystalline form reflecting the firelight in complex patterns. "His trapping methodology uses approximately 97% less energy than ration synthesis for equivalent nutritional output. The return on invested effort is actually remarkable. Furthermore, the materials required are essentially unlimited in any biosphere, whereas synthesizer technology requires rare earth elements and complex manufacturing processes." "That is not the point," Cora argued, though his heart was not in it. Hard to argue against efficiency while eating your third piece of perfectly smoked meat. The point is that we are supposed to be beyond this. We have technology. We have advancement. We have left these practices behind for good reasons. What reasons? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Because they are brutal, because they require killing, because civilized beings should not need to hunt their own food like animals. But you are eating it, Marcus pointed out reasonably. That is different. How? Cora opened his mouth, closed it, and could not come up with an answer that did not sound ridiculous. We have advancement that failed completely, Vectress pointed out. Meanwhile, he has primitive skills that work perfectly. There is something philosophically disturbing about that. Marcus, listening to this conversation while tending his fire, just smiled. Not primitive, traditional. There is a difference. Explain the difference, Drummeth requested, his analytical nature demanding precision. Primitive means outdated, useless, something you leave behind because you found something better. Traditional means something you keep because it still works, because it connects you to where you came from, and because you never know when you might need it. He turned a piece of meat on the rack, checking its progress with a critical eye. Humanity got pretty advanced. We have fusion reactors and quantum computers and ships that bend space. But we also remember how to start a fire without matches, how to find water, how to catch food with our hands if we need to. We keep the old skills around, just in case you crash on a primitive planet during a storm and all your technology fails, Vectress said. Yeah, just in case that. Marcus poked the fire, sending sparks drifting upward. My grandfather used to say that technology is great right up until the moment it breaks, and it always breaks eventually. When it does, you either know how to handle yourself, or you sit there being very advanced and very hungry and waiting for someone else to save you. That is a depressingly practical philosophy, Drummeth observed. It has kept humans alive through some pretty rough situations, such as ice ages, droughts, floods, plagues, every natural disaster you can think of, and a few you probably cannot. We survived all of it because we could adapt, because we kept the skills that worked, and because we were too stubborn to die, just because the situation was not ideal. Marcus grinned. Also, we are really good at figuring out creative ways to kill things and eat them, which is apparently a skill set that remains relevant even in the space age. On the 9th day, the storm finally broke. The rescue shuttle arrived 6 hours later, guided in by the emergency beacon that had been uselessly shouting into the electromagnetic interference the entire time. Captain Wren of the rescue vessel descended the ramp expecting to find survivors in various stages of starvation and psychological distress. What she found instead was a well-organized camp, 4 individuals in good health, and approximately 30 kilograms of smoked meat hanging on elaborate drying racks. "Commander Vectress," she asked, because she had to confirm she was looking at the right survivors. They did not look like people who had been stranded in survival conditions for 9 days. "Captain Wren, good to see you. Your biometric data indicated you should be experiencing caloric deficit and dehydration. The readings we received before communication was lost suggested you were facing critical supply shortages." "Yes, well." Vectress glanced at Marcus, who was packing up his smoking racks with the same care most people reserved for expensive equipment. "The situation evolved." "Evolved how?" "It turns out," Vectress said slowly, choosing his words with the precision of someone filing a report that no one was going to believe, "that humans still practice primitive food acquisition and preservation techniques. As a cultural tradition, and that these techniques remain remarkably effective even when, or perhaps especially when, advanced technology fails. Captain Wren looked at Marcus, who waved cheerfully. She looked at the smoking racks. She looked at the processed animal skins that had been stretched for drying. She looked at the organized workspace, the efficient shelter structure, the stockpile of preserved food that could probably feed them for another 2 weeks if necessary. She looked back at her datapad, where the official rescue protocols had absolutely no categories for any of this. "I am going to need a very detailed report," she said finally. "I am aware I have been composing it mentally for the past 6 days. Does it include an explanation for why you have more food now than when you crashed?" "It does. You are not going to believe it. Try me." Marcus approached the rescue shuttle, carrying a bundle wrapped in broad leaves. "Captain, you want some smoked meat for the trip back. It is pretty good, and we have way more than we can eat. Seems a shame to waste it." Captain Wren, who had eaten nothing but synthesized rations for the past 3 weeks, found herself accepting the bundle before her brain could properly process what she was doing. She unwrapped it slightly. The smell was incredible. It smelled like real food, like something that had grown and lived rather than being assembled molecule by molecule in a synthesizer chamber. "This is from You Caught This." "Yep. Local herbivores. Taste kind of like a cross between chicken and venison, if you know what those are. The smoking process really brings out the flavor. Used some local herbs too, found them growing near the creek. Pretty sure they are not toxic because I have been eating them for a week, and I am still alive." She took a small bite. Her eyes widened. "This is actually excellent. Thanks. My grandfather's recipe. Well, his technique anyway. The seasoning I had to improvise from local plants, but it worked out pretty well." Marcus looked genuinely pleased by the compliment. "You know, if you want, I can show your crew how to do this. Never know when it might come in handy." Word spread quickly. By the time they reached the orbital station, half the crew had tried Marcus's smoked meat. By the time they reached the nearest inhabited system, the story had evolved into legend. By the time they returned to Corps headquarters, every officer in the Expeditionary Survey branch had heard about the human who hunted in a storm that grounded shuttles and made meat that tasted better than anything a synthesizer could produce. The story grew with each retelling, as stories do. Some versions claimed Marcus had wrestled the animals with his bare hands. Others suggested he had built an entire smoking facility complete with temperature controls out of nothing but rocks and determination. The truth was impressive enough, but truth rarely satisfied people looking for a good story. Across 17 star systems, among species who had long ago abandoned such practices in favor of more civilized methods, a quiet conversation began. A slightly embarrassed conversation, conducted in the sort of hushed tones usually reserved for admitting you still enjoyed children's entertainment or had never actually read the classic literature everyone claimed to have read. The conversation went something like this. Maybe, possibly, perhaps humans had a point about keeping the old skills around, just in case. For emergencies. Not because anyone expected to actually need them, of course, but because the universe had an unfortunate tendency to break your expensive technology at the worst possible moment, and it would be really awkward to starve to death next to a planet full of edible animals because no one remembered how to catch one. The requests started arriving at human military academies within a month. Politely worded, carefully diplomatic requests for instruction in what the correspondents delicately termed pre-technological survival methodologies. The humans, who had been offering these courses for centuries and watching other species politely decline with barely concealed revulsion, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with applications. Marcus himself received a promotion and a job offer he had not applied for Chief Wilderness Survival Instructor, Expeditionary Survey Corps, Multi-Species Division. The position had been created specifically for him, mostly because no one else in the Corps knew how to build a snare, and now everyone wanted to learn. The salary was excellent. The benefits package included hazard pay for teaching in adverse weather conditions. The job description made him laugh for approximately 10 minutes straight. His first class had 47 students from 11 different species. They stood in the rain because Marcus insisted on authenticity and learned how to identify tracks, set snares, build fires, and smoke meat. They complained constantly. They got wet, cold, frustrated, and occasionally injured in minor ways. Every single one of them passed the course and immediately applied the skills to their field certification requirements. More requests came in. Within a year, every major exploration organization in civilized space had implemented mandatory primitive survival training. The courses were advertised as emergency preparedness protocols because that sounded better than admitting that advanced spacefaring civilizations needed humans to teach them how to catch rabbits and cook them over a fire. The humans, for their part, found the whole situation hilarious. They had been trying to convince other species that the old skills mattered for decades. All it took was one storm, one crashed shuttle, and one very practical grandfather's lessons to prove the point. Marcus ran his training programs for 3 years before retiring to write a book titled Traditional Skills for Modern Emergencies, a practical guide to not starving when your technology breaks. It became required reading in 17 star systems. The chapter on building snares in adverse weather conditions was considered the definitive text on the subject. Commander Vectris, who had filed the most unusual after-action report in Corps history, went on to become an advocate for practical skills training. He gave speeches at academies and conferences, always opening with the same line, "I used to think advancement meant leaving primitive skills behind. Then I spent 9 days watching a human catch dinner in a storm, and I learned the difference between primitive and traditional." Lieutenant Cora overcame his initial horror and actually became quite good at trap setting. He never enjoyed it exactly, but he appreciated the reliability of a skill that worked regardless of power sources or technical specifications. Ensign Drummeth published a paper on the energy efficiency of traditional food acquisition methods that became surprisingly influential in resource management circles. His conclusion, stated with crystalline clarity, was that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most elegant, because, as it turned out, after 17,000 years of technological advancement, after mastering faster-than-light travel and quantum computing and artificial gravity, the universe still occasionally required you to catch your own dinner in the rain. And when that happened, it helped significantly if someone in your crew remembered how to build a snare, start a fire, and smoke meat, while water dripped down their neck and the wind howled like judgmental laughter. The old skills, it seemed, were not primitive after all. They were insurance, they were tradition, they were the things you kept around just in case everything advanced failed, which it did, regularly and without warning. Humanity had known this all along. It had just taken the rest of the galaxy 9 very wet, very hungry days to figure it out. And now, across civilized space, in training facilities on dozens of worlds, instructors taught their students how to survive with nothing but their hands, their knowledge, and their willingness to get a little uncomfortable. The most advanced species in the galaxy were learning to build fires in the rain, and somehow that made perfect sense.